Thank you very much, Jonathan, and welcome to all of you, and welcome to you, Prime Minister. Let me start by asking about something which I think every Canadian wants to learn about, which is Australia is often called the lucky country. And from an economic point of view, that has certainly been the case. And many people in this room may not realize, but Australia had 30 years, not 30 quarters, 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth without a recession until COVID hit, and we all know what happened then. Can you give us any insight into what the magic formula is? Because we've just come through the worst decade for economic growth in Canada since the Depression.
Well, thanks, Brian. It's wonderful to be here. If I could just say at the outset that Australia and Canada are very similar countries. We're both, if you like, settled dominions. We're both resource-rich countries. We're both very multi-ethnic societies. Immigration has been at the heart of our national stories, and the fact that people have been able to come here from all parts of the world and make a good life in our countries is much to our credit, and obviously it's much to the credit of our immigrants. So I'm determined to do what I can in my post-parliamentary life to build a stronger and deeper relationship between Australia and Canada. Yeah, there was a famous book, The Lucky Country, written about Australia in the 1960s by a fellow called Donald Horne. He meant it as ironic. We were a country run by second-rate people relying on our luck to get through. But we've embraced the term as a description of ourselves, and we are blessed by nature. Our climate is so much more benign than your climate here. Our resources are no less than yours here. I think our people are equally enterprising and creative as yours. So we are a lucky country. My disappointment with Australia is that in recent times we haven't made enough of ourselves. We could be better than we are, and there's a sense in which that's true of all countries at all times, but I think we've been falling further short of where we should be more often lately. Now, you say we've had 30 years without a technical recession, and you're right. We have had 30 years without a technical recession, but we have been in a per capita recession for the last 4 quarters. And in the previous 30 years, we had 3 recessions on a per capita basis. In fact, what's been masking relatively poor productivity growth and comparatively modest economic performance, at least over the last decade, has been dramatically increased immigration. And as you know, immigration makes the overall GDP figures look good because it grows the cake, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets a bigger slice of the cake, and that's been our problem. So to do justice to Australia, yes, under the Hawke government and then under the Howard government. The Hawke was a Labor government, the Howard government was a Conservative government. We had a quarter century of very significant economic reform, but frankly there hasn't been a lot of reform, certainly a lot of productivity enhancing reform in the last decade and a half. And without wanting to blow my own trumpet too much, the abolition of the carbon taxes and the mining taxes by my government and the 2014 budget, which was a serious attempt to reduce the overall size of government, are probably the only significant economic reforms of the last 15 years. Now, people on the other side of the fence would talk about things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but frankly, that's a fiscal nightmare. It's certainly been good at providing more services to people with disabilities, but there's an eligibility issue, there's an entitlement issue, there's a cost control issue, and it's typical of government programs. They easily get out of control, which is one of the reasons why a properly conservative government is very, very careful about starting new programs, because once they're there, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. And sometimes we discover that what seems like a good idea at the time ain't so great in practice.
Well, we'll get back to that in a minute, but you mentioned in your opening remarks that Canada and Australia were both endowed with considerable natural resources. You know, it's funny, many Canadians somehow think natural resources are a bit of a curse, and they complain about being hewers of wood and drawers of water, and that we're too reliant on natural resources. What's your view as a leader of Australia about the role of natural resources in the success of your country?
Well, if you go back and look at the economics of our country, as you know, we were started as a penal colony. In fact, the original modern Australians, as opposed to the Indigenous inhabitants of our country, the original modern Australians were chosen by the finest judges in England. And the penal colony was on the verge of starvation for several years after 1788 because the soils, the climate were completely unfamiliar. The Australian landscape is radically different from the landscape in the Northern Hemisphere. Our soils are thin, our rain is either non-existent or torrential. We suffer from drought extensively. So it really took at least a decade for the original British settlers to work out how to grow stuff successfully. We were rescued a couple of times by ships sent from the East India Company in Bengal. Our first successful industry was whaling and sealing. Then in the 1820s and 30s, we figured out that merino sheep did extremely well in our vast open spaces. Then, of course, there was gold in the 1850s and beyond. The gold had largely run out by the 1890s, yet in the 1890s we were supposedly, on a per capita basis, the richest country on earth, and marvellous Melbourne in the 1880s was the second city of the British Empire. Our 20th century was economically much less successful. We had a massive drought, the so-called Federation drought, which devastated our agricultural industries in the early years of the 20th century. We thought we were very light on for mineral resources. In fact, Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies, or Mr Menzies as he then was in all sorts of trouble for exporting our limited supplies of iron ore to Japan in the late 1930s. He was given the epithet Pig Iron Bob for exporting iron ore to Japan, and some of it probably came back to us in an unwanted way a couple of years later. But then in the 1960s, we suddenly discovered these massive, massive treasure troves in Queensland, in Western Australia, in other parts. Today, in some years, Australia is the biggest exporter of natural gas, one of the biggest exporters of metallurgical and thermal coal, and by far and away the biggest exporter of iron ore. And but for these resource industries, our economy would essentially be that of New Zealand, and our living standard would be probably 20 or 30% below where it actually is, at least in dollar terms. So resources have been incredibly important to modern Australia. But here's the problem. thanks to the climate cult, we are increasingly reluctant to make the most of them. And it is the policy of the current government in Australia to minimise and eventually eliminate the use of fossil fuels, including the coal and the gas, which are our second and third largest exports. Now, I've got to say that strikes me as the very midsummer of madness. It strikes me as a moonbeam from the larger lunacy, and yet it is the official policy of the Australian government. I'm all in favour of reducing emissions, but I'm certainly not in favour of reducing emissions in ways which destroy jobs, drive industries offshore, and seriously damage people's cost of living. And I do want to make it absolutely crystal clear, Brian, that as far as I'm concerned, there is no climate crisis. It's far from clear that the main factor in what climate change there is mankind's carbon dioxide, and we certainly should not be pursuing climate policies that end up weakening our country or our countries, yet don't actually reduce global emissions because China and India, for all sorts of perfectly good reasons, have no intention of reducing their own anytime soon.
Well, since you mentioned China, let's talk about that. The rise of China, in my view anyway, is really the defining geopolitical fact of the 21st century. And Australia has a front row seat to that rise. And even more than Canada, Australia feels the pull of economic gravity from that rising China. And China is now your largest trading partner. And yet, somehow Australia seems to have managed to keep a little bit of critical distance from China and to strike a balanced approach to China, understanding, let's say, the national security risks that close relationship with China brings, but still wanting to have that close economic relationship. How do you square that circle? Because this is something we're wrestling with in this country every day.
Look, you raise a lot of issues there, Brian. Can I start by making a very important distinction between the Chinese people and the current Chinese government? The current Chinese government, I think, is a menace. I think it's a real danger to its own people, to its neighbours, and to the wider world. But the Chinese people are good people, like people everywhere. The Chinese people, like all of us, by and large, want to get on with life, do the right thing by their neighbours, help their family to get ahead, and so on. And it's important, given the fact that both our countries have significant Chinese diasporas, that we don't do anything that makes Canadians and Australians of Chinese background feel like they're not welcome in their own country. I want to make that very important distinction right up front. Now, in recent times, China has been by far Australia's largest trading partner. We do something like $250 billion a year of two-way trade with China, and it's overwhelmingly in our favour. I think we export twice as much in dollar terms to China as we import from them. So plainly, it's a very important economic relationship. And there is, in a sense, a natural business constituency for maintaining the best possible relations with China. And yet the reality is that we are now at the beginning of a new Cold War, a Cold War that in some respects could be even more difficult and dangerous than the other one, because the Soviet Union, Russia, was always a third-rate economy, despite having a first-rate military. China, on the other hand, is a first-rate economy, thanks to the limited market liberalisations of Deng Xiaoping and subsequently with rapidly developing a military to match. China is a much more significant long-term geostrategic challenge than Russia ever was. We have, because of misplaced optimism about how economic liberalisation would be followed by a degree of political liberalisation, because of goodwill, which was, in a sense, to our credit and understandable at the time, welcomed China into our global trading systems. China is now embedded in many critical supply chains, including renewable energy supply chains, electric vehicle supply chains, and so on. And frankly, we are going to have to, over time, do everything we can to cut China out of those critical supply chains, because what Australia discovered over the last few years, because of some actions that we took that displeased the Chinese government, we have discovered that as far as the current Beijing regime is concerned, trade is just politics by other means. Trade is strategy by other means, to be turned on and off like a tap. When the Australian government, quite properly, called for an independent international investigation into the origins of the Wuhan virus, the Chinese government slapped arbitrary boycotts on about $20 billion a year of trade. They basically stopped buying our thermal coal, they stopped buying our wine, our beef, our barley, etc., as a form of punishment. And you can be absolutely certain that in the event of a crisis, any vulnerability to China would be maximally exploited. And as we've seen through the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, it's essentially debt trap diplomacy. The Beijing government offering what looked like favourable loans that other countries and other entities wouldn't offer to vulnerable countries, and then as soon as the loans can't be repaid, moving in to claim all sorts of desirable things, such as ports in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. So look, it's a very difficult relationship. I don't know that we are managing it any better than anyone else. The important thing is that the two critical things are, A, to be completely clear-eyed about the nature of the current regime, and second, to do your best to limit any dependency on China. But that doesn't mean that we can't keep selling them commodities, but anything that involved the transfer of sophisticated technology, etc., would be a dreadful mistake in the current circumstances.
Yeah, of course, you know that Canada, not alone, but Canada suffered some severe consequences when we displeased China.
And a couple
of our citizens were taken hostage. Japan, when it displeased China, was slapped with a rare earth export ban, which was a dagger aimed at the industrial heart of Japan.
And Australia had to rescue Japan. And of course, the Japanese helped us to rescue them, I hasten to add, because we have one rare earth exporter, Lynas, which was in all sorts of trouble until the Chinese slapped the ban on the Japanese, and then the Japanese helped to keep Lynas going so that there was an alternative supplier of these rare earths. But I mean, the interesting thing about China is that it has exploited freer trade without practicing free trade itself. I mean, it's massively subsidised its own industries to get them into dominant positions. and then, of course, having driven out so much of the competition, it's in a position to effectively exercise commercial blackmail over other countries.
Now, you know, the example you cited of an Australian company coming to the rescue of Japan in the face of the Chinese rare earth export ban, and then Japan reciprocating by investing presumably in that company. That's an interesting example of something that we're wrestling with, which is this whole critical minerals issue because of the so-called energy transition, electric vehicles, solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these critical minerals are going to be in very short supply, and yet China has more dominance of that industry than OPEC has of the oil industry, and so there's a drive for us to become more self-sufficient in the West in critical minerals, and yet China seems to be the only one that's willing to actually invest in them.
Well, both Canada and Australia are abundant potential sources of the critical minerals. The question is the processing and refinement of the critical minerals, and because that's often a very dirty business, we'd rather have the Chinese dirty their hands with this than do it ourselves. Now, this is where, if I may say so, there is a gulf between the desire of the green movement to gallop towards electric vehicles and renewable energy and their utter unwillingness to see us have energy-intensive processing and refinement industries in our own countries. And this is where the whole green thing, again, has been, I mean, we've been played like a harp by the Chinese on this. They constantly talk green at international conferences while not practicing anything green much themselves. And our own efforts to be greener than green have ended up making us even more dependent than before on China. So, look, there are a whole lot of things that we are getting wrong right now as economies, as cultures, as militaries. There are a whole lot of things that we are getting wrong as a broad West at this time that we just have to start thinking straight about, and we just have to start getting a bit of intellectual and moral clarity about. And the whole green thing is at the heart of so much of it.
Well, talking about intellectual and moral clarity, you I'm sure are aware that Canada is currently holding a public inquiry into foreign interference in our society. And while countries like Russia and India and Iran play supporting roles in this drama of foreign interference, it's clear that the starring role is being played by China.
Don't underestimate Russia.
Believe me, I'm not underestimating Russia, but as I say, the inquiry into foreign interference is certainly focusing principally on China at the moment. Has Australia been concerned about China's ambition to shape society and politics and so on, reaching in through its business and other relationships? And what lessons do you want to pass on to Canadians about how to deal with, by all means, Russia, let's talk about that, but also particularly China?
Well, I should, by way of mea culpa, say that when I was Prime Minister, I did a free trade deal with China. And at the time, 2014, I was incredibly happy to do it because it was the first free trade deal that China had done with another G20 country. And on the face of it, it was a very beneficial deal for us, as well as being good for China. But I do say that I think 2014, 2015 was probably the last time when we could reasonably justify ongoing optimism about China's potential liberalisation as opposed to lapse back lapsing back into authoritarianism. In fact, it's interesting. Xi Jinping gave a speech to the Australian Parliament in late 2014, and the official English language version of Xi Jinping's speech said, quote, "China will be fully democratic by mid-century." Now, even though what the Chinese mean by democracy and what we know to be democracy is quite different, I still thought it was significant that the Chinese chose to express his words in that way to us. That was when they were still in their hide and bide period. Hide your strength, bide your time, present a smiley face to the world. It was only a few years later that the wolf warrior started to come out. It was starting in 2015 that the South China Sea was militarised. It was at about that time the social credit system was introduced into China. It was shortly thereafter that they turned Xinjiang province into a giant concentration camp. So it was possible to be optimistic about China then. Now, a word of substantial praise for my successor. Malcolm Turnbull and I had our differences inside the government, but as Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull was really one of the first heads of government to start to take significant action against China's attempts to compromise us. He banned Huawei from our 5G network, and he introduced foreign interference legislation, which hasn't always worked as intended, but it was at least an attempt to confront the reality of Chinese governmental operatives and friends of the Beijing regime doing their best to insidiously influence influential people in Australia in their direction. And there was a book written by a left-wing academic, Clive Hamilton, called Silent Invasion. That was published in about 2017, I think, and that was really the first, I think, comprehensive expose of the totality of China's United Front activities, not just inside the local Chinese community or Chinese Australian community, but inside business groups, community groups, even philanthropic groups and universities. It was really the first comprehensive analysis, a real eye-opener to us as to exactly what was going on. And look, it goes on to this day. And plainly, China is constantly trying to penetrate our IT networks, constantly trying to harvest commercial, strategic, military secrets, constantly trying to motivate people in our society against things that they would regard as against their interests. And we just have to accept that this is an across-the-board strategic competition which is enabled by technology in ways that we never had to work with back in the old days of the First Cold War. I mean, even the algorithms running things like TikTok are pitched to divide our society and to spread messages which are probably not as helpful as we would like them to be. Just to give you one other example before we move on to other topics, I mean, you might remember in Britain a year or so back, Britain lost the final of, I think, the Soccer World Cup or something in a penalty shootout. And it so happened that the British soccer players that were doing the penalty shootout were black Britons, and there was a social media campaign, an utterly racist social media campaign, and it turned out that something like 99% of the racist social media posts that were then used to portray Britain as an utterly irredeemably racist society emanated from Russia. Mm. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's being done on a routine basis.
Well, that's a nice segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was Australia is known these days in Washington as America's favorite ally, whereas Canada is seen as a defense-free rider and ultimately perhaps an unreliable national security partner by the same political authorities in Washington. Tell us about how national security issues are seen by the political class and by ordinary Australians, because how you arrive at things like a cross-party consensus on the new AUKUS arrangement, the spending of hundreds of billions of dollars on defense issues, it just seems to us to be unimaginable. Because in Canada, our politicians take it as a matter of course, or a matter of faith, that voters don't and won't care. Whereas Australia seems to be able to talk about these things in an adult way. Why is that?
Well, I suppose there's a sense in which if Canada wanted to, it could take no interest in defence because it doesn't have borders with hostile or potentially hostile neighbours, and it does have a very large and benevolent neighbour, perhaps occasionally blundering, but nevertheless certainly benevolent neighbour, which obviously as the one superpower is, or the democratic superpower, is more than capable of defending itself. So there's a sense in which Canada could opt out of the national security business if it really wanted to, in the same way that New Zealand could, because New Zealand has a neighbour which is larger, more powerful, and normally more strategically engaged. I should say that in tribute to Canada, that in 2 world wars, Canada rose magnificently to the crisis of the democracies, and like Australia in the Great War, Canada more than did its fair share of the fighting. And along with our own General Monash, your General Currie, the two of them were probably the best British generals of the First World War. And Canada bore a heavy share of the liberation of Western Europe, had a beach to itself, as it were, on D-Day. So Canada's done mighty work, and as recently as the Afghanistan war, Canada more than pulled its weight. So good on Canada. I suppose, like other countries, Canada does need to lift its game in defence terms. Australia needs to lift its game as well. I mean, when I took office, we were spending 1.5% of GDP on the military. It was the lowest percentage spend on the military since 1938, and we lifted it to 2%. Frankly, we need to go to 3% and perhaps beyond now, given the scale of the challenges, because frankly, we cannot rely on the United States to be our defender of last resort. In extremis, we have to be prepared to do that ourselves. And that's essentially why we've gone down the AUKUS submarine route, because nuclear-powered submarines are, if you like, the apex predator of the sea. They are the ultimate strategic deterrent. We are not proposing to put nuclear weapons on our submarines. I want to make that absolutely crystal clear. But nuclear-powered submarines can move at great speed. They can stay at sea almost indefinitely. They can be equipped with powerful conventional weaponry, such that you could inflict massive damage on any adversary, even a superpower. And in the end, a country such as Australia, which is a strong middle power, needs to be able to say to any other country on earth, don't mess with us, don't mess with us. And so that's what the AUKUS program is all about. And again, all credit to my successor, Scott Morrison, for doing something which I would have liked to have done myself, frankly, but the circumstances didn't make it possible in my time. In my time, I did do my best to upgrade our submarine deterrent. My plan was to get the best available conventional submarines, which I was advised was the Japanese Soryu class. I certainly took the view that the Japanese wouldn't put their sailors to sea in a submarine that was incapable of taking on the best that the Russians and the Chinese could throw at them. And I thought, well, let's get the Soryu class for Australia. Unfortunately, that was derailed by the politics of South Australia, the at times cargo cult politics of South Australia. My successor then tried to get a French nuclear submarine, redesign it and rebuild it over 15 years as a conventional submarine. I mean, the idea of spending 15 years to get a submarine that's inferior to something that exists at the moment, I think is not smart. Took us a long time to realise just how unsmart it was, but all credit to Scott Morrison for putting together the AUKUS deal with Boris Johnson and Joe Biden. And to the credit of both sides of politics in all three countries, it has bipartisan support. And it is a sign, let's give the opposition, the then opposition Labor Party its due, it is a sign of the fundamental seriousness and the fundamental, I suppose, civic and patriotic spirit of both the governmental and the opposition parties in the three countries, that they were able to come to this very important arrangement for the ongoing security of our part of the world and indeed the wider world.
So would I be right in thinking that you're giving a fair bit of credit to the political class for having worked this out internally, in other words, between the parties, but also for taking the argument to the country and saying, and making the case to voters in a convincing way? Because this is something we have little experience of in Canada in recent years. These things divide the parties, and the politicians seem to me to be quite happy to say, oh, well, we would never, the public opinion isn't in favour and there's nothing we can do about that.
Well, this was one of those rare and fragrant examples of a Prime Minister and a couple of his senior colleagues deciding that we needed to do something quite different. We needed to make a dramatic departure from many decades of previous practice for our country's sake, making a decision, being prepared to argue for it, an opposition accepting that it too had to, as it were, walk away from many decades of previous positioning. And the interesting thing is that if you had asked the Australian public a week before the AUKUS decision was announced, should Australia get nuclear-powered submarines, to the extent that they'd thought about it, they would have said no. But a week afterwards, if you asked them, to the extent that they'd thought about it, a majority would have said yes. And this is where sometimes an idea's time has come, and if you can pick that moment, you can bring about dramatic change. Other times, you've got to go out into the marketplace of ideas, argue very hard for an unpopular position, be prepared to take a lot of incoming flack, and you may or may not succeed, but if it really is the right thing to do, you should do it. You should do it. And look, I've got to say on the question of energy and climate, when I became the leader of the opposition back in 2009, my then opponent, the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, was constantly saying that climate change is the greatest political, economic and moral challenge of our time. And his policy at that time was to introduce an emissions trading scheme, which is a kind of floating carbon tax. And I became opposition leader on a clear policy, by one vote I hasten to add, in the party room. I became opposition leader on a clear policy of opposing the carbon tax. And I can remember saying in my first press conference as party leader, the job of an opposition is not to make weak compromises with a bad government. The job of an opposition is to be a clear alternative. And so I was absolutely crystal clear from day one that we were against Labor's emissions trading scheme, or carbon tax, floating carbon tax. And at the time it was said, well, you know, this is mission impossible. Mission impossible. Everyone believes that climate change is a dreadful threat. But I was able to change climate from, if you like, an environmental issue and, if you like, a moral issue into an economic issue. Sure, we all want to do the right thing by the only planet we've got, but we have to be realistic about the cost of policy to deal with this. And so in the 2010 election that I was expected to get absolutely slaughtered in, we reduced Labor to minority government. And in the 2013 election, by which time the Labor Party had actually introduced a carbon tax, and I campaigned non-stop against the carbon tax, at the 2013 election, we had a landslide win. And interestingly, at the three elections that we've had in Australia where energy and climate have been absolute front and centre, the Liberal National Coalition, the Conservative coalition, if you like, adopting a sceptical, if you like, or realist, if you prefer, position on all this, has done extremely well. And it's the old story. You ask people, should we do something about climate change? 90% will say, sure, we've got to do something about climate change. You ask them, are you prepared to pay $100, $1,000 or more? And they'll say, no, hang on. No, we're not going to do it. And the climate zealots, the climate fanatics, if you like, have only succeeded because they've, quite falsely in my view, said that you could do all these climate measures at no cost. For instance, the opposition went into the 2022 election campaign in Australia claiming that moving to 82% renewables within 8 years was going to reduce power bills by $275 per household per year within 3 years. In fact, power bills in Australia have gone up 20% a year over the last 2 years. And the cost of moving to 82% renewables by 2030, the total economy cost was recently estimated by a tri-university working party involving our former chief scientist at $1.5 trillion. So that's effectively a 100% of GDP bill just in 8 years to move to an 82% renewable power sector. Now, I mean, you know, I think we should be able to continue to drive our V8 powered pickups. We should be able to continue to eat beef. We should be able to continue to heat our houses in winter. We should be able to continue to fly away on our business and leisure trips. I don't think we should turn people's lifestyle upside down in the name of reducing emissions. What we should do is sensibly move to more efficient coal-fired power stations, use more gas, which is 50% less emissions intensive than coal, and as you are doing in Ontario, get more and more of our power from nuclear, which is the only currently technologically feasible way of producing emissions-free baseload power on an economy-wide basis. So that's what we should do, and I am confident that the policy of the Conservative coalition at the next election in Australia will have 4 elements. First, no more coal-fired power stations to close until there is a reliable alternative. Second, rapid exploitation of the gas reserves that we know we have and which are currently being sabotaged by green lawfare. Third, no more subsidies for new renewables. And fourth, end the ban on civil nuclear power in Australia, because again, the very midsummer of madness is to be very enthusiastic for nuclear power tied up at the dock, but completely outraged by nuclear power on land. I mean, how can we have nuclear power at sea without also having nuclear power on land?
I have 2 more questions for you, Tony, and we've got about 10 minutes, so you quite rightly talked about Canada's contribution to the First and Second World War. My father, in addition to serving in the Second World War, served in Korea, etc. So Canada has a long and proud record of contributing to not only the international military effort, but the founding of the United Nations, the writing of the International Human Rights Convention, etc. And yet, you know, we talked about the Indo-Pacific being where the fate of the world is being played out in this century. We've talked about AUKUS. There's the new economic association that the liberal democracies are putting together. Canada's not even being invited to the table. So, yes, we have a proud history, but somehow right now, the past is the past. This is today. We're not even being taken seriously enough to be invited to the places where the architecture that is being created to deal with the rise of China is being created. Why is that?
Well, look, I don't want to get too deeply into the domestic politics of Canada. My Canadian counterpart was Stephen Harper, and I don't think that there was any opting out from the challenges of our time by Stephen Harper and Canada under Stephen Harper. And I am really encouraged by what I'm seeing from Pierre Poilievre. I think he has the potential to be a really outstanding Prime Minister of Canada, and I think he has the potential to be a galvanic Conservative leader globally, because let's be honest, we have been a bit light on for successful Conservative governments, certainly in the Anglosphere in recent times. The government that I led was in many respects a disappointment. The Conservative government in Britain has been in many respects a disappointment. I mean, let's give Boris Johnson credit for Brexit. Let's give David Cameron credit for some important domestic policy improvements, the charter schools, some of the changes to welfare, the attempt to get the budget back under control and so on. As I said, my government repealed the carbon tax and the mining tax. We stopped a wave of illegal migration by small boats. Malcolm Turnbull did, I think, help the world to wake up to the peril of Beijing. Scott Morrison did create AUKUS. So there have been good things from recent Conservative governments, and I'm leaving the United States out of it for the moment. There have been good things from recent Conservative governments, but still, we haven't had a Thatcher government. We haven't had a Reagan administration. It would be a wonderful thing to see here in Canada a really successful Conservative government that wins an election by speaking the plain truth to people and then governs as a Conservative government. A government which says what it means and does what it says. That's what we are looking for, and I think that's exactly what we're going to get from Pierre Poilievre.
Well, my last question, Tony, you used a phrase a moment ago, the Anglosphere, and a different name which has sometimes been given to the same idea as CANZUK or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. In other words, a new grouping of English-speaking countries with not just a common language and history, but belief in a muscular approach to defense of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and so forth, without having America as part of it, with all the baggage that America carries. You were quite an advocate for the idea of the English-speaking countries, as I've described them, taking more of a role in the international world. Tell us what you think this grouping would bring to the world that doesn't already exist.
Well, if you look at the main English-speaking countries, whatever our contemporary difficulties might be, whatever our passing problems might be, all of them are really the best societies that have ever been created in terms of freedom, fairness, prosperity, in terms of giving everyone who's prepared to have a go a fair go, freedom to think, freedom to speak, freedom to act. I mean, nowhere has this been done better than in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and frankly, some of the other countries that have done really well are countries that have been similarly influenced, I suppose, by the civilization and the culture which grew up in Britain. From Magna Carta, the provisions of Oxford, the Glorious Revolution, etc. So the fact that millions of people every year do their damnedest to come to these countries, legally and illegally, shows that even today, notwithstanding our current comparative demoralisation, we are wonderfully attractive societies. We are universal magnets. We obviously are better at embodying the universal aspirations of humanity than just about any other places. So we certainly should stand together. And I always found at any global gathering, first of all as a minister in the Howard government and then as a Prime Minister in my own and subsequently as a sort of elder person. I don't say statesman because a statesman is a dead politician and I'm not dead and I don't want to be anytime soon. But as a sort of a political retiree or as a recovering politician, in any of these gatherings, there's, if you like, a natural affinity with your colleagues from within the Anglosphere. And indeed, heavily Anglosphere countries such as Israel, for instance. I mean, you talk to an Israeli politician on either side of the fence, just like you talk to a Canadian politician on either side of the fence. And the things that unite you are always more important in the long run than anything that might divide you. So I think it is very important, given all the complementarities, the ease of working together that we have because of not just the language, but the history and the culture and the sort of the mental hemisphere. Because of the ease we have of working together, it's really important that we make the most of that. Because while the world at the end of 2019, for all its difficulties, was in a pretty good space. I mean, the world in 2019 was more free, more fair, more rich, more safe for more people than at any other time in human history. First, we had the pandemic, which involved a lot of self-inflicted damage in the name of staying safe. Then we had the Ukraine war, which hasn't just killed hundreds of thousands of people, but it's inflicted a lot of economic damage, not just on Russia and Ukraine, but on many other countries too. We've now got the convulsions, which could readily get much worse very quickly in the Middle East, and we've just got the lurking menace of Beijing, which we must never forget has as its stated goal not just taking Taiwan, but being the world's #1 power by mid-century. And I have to say, a world dominated by the commissars in Beijing would be a very different world and a much worse world than the world which has, I suppose, been under the sway of the Anglo-American ascendancy for the best part of 2 centuries.
Lovely.
Thank you, Tony and Brian.
Well, and ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but I think after what Jonathan quite properly called this wonderful master class in geopolitical and geostrategic thinking, that we here in Canada might say to the next Australian we meet, you made a terrible mistake when you didn't re-elect. Well, actually, it wasn't the Australians who didn't re-elect Mr. Abbott, but his own party who caused his departure from the scene. But Australia was incredibly well served by this man as Prime Minister, and I think he has a tremendous amount to offer to us and to the liberal democratic world as we think about how to confront all of the issues that he's talked about so eloquently tonight. So please join me again in thanking Tony Abbott.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
And I thank you.